Hi, I'm Dennis. If you have already seen my video where I carved a female torso out of plywood, you may also want to check out how I made this version 2.0 out of a thick branch and transparent green epoxy resin. I used the same 3D model that I had made in my previous video, but instead of slicing it, I added axles to the top and bottom so that I could mount it in the rotary setup. I also added limit planes to set the stock Z dimensions and divided the model into quarters for a 4-sided job by placing diagonal limit planes for the X and Y boundaries and to set the deepest point that a 4-inch bit with an effective carving depth of 75 mm can reach. I saved it as an STL file and rotated the model in 90-degree steps for the other 3 sides. I then imported these STL files in VCarve to design the toolpath. Alright, enough talk. Let's get started. I cut MDF panels to assemble the mold, so that the stock would be almost double the height between the router and the CNC bed. I covered the surface with duct tape for easy release from the epoxy, and closed the seams with heat glue. I removed the bark from a withered tree trunk and cleaned it up with a steel brush. To orient the wood, I took pictures from all sides and created a 3D model by photogrammetry in Xavier. I made it to scale, combined it with the female torso, and positioned it. I repeated these steps for a second trunk to cover most of the torso. I displayed the stock dimensions to visualize the boundaries and drew these intersections onto the branches. I cut the lines with the chainsaw and used a belt sander to make the wood fit perfectly in the mold. I did the same for the other trunk and then glued the pieces in place. According to my calculations, I needed a bit more than 5 liters of epoxy resin. With such a large volume, I opted for slow setting floral epoxy so that it wouldn't overheat. I filled 2 buckets, mixed it well, and added a few drops of translucent Rainforest Green dye. After pouring everything in a mold, I made a bit extra with Green Mica powder for a sparkling effect, and randomly dropped it in until the wood was completely submerged. After a week, the epoxy had hardened enough to take it out of the mold. I marked the center on each end and also marked the locations of the attachment holes of the octagonal rotary plates that I had made previously for the 3D earth, drilled the pilot holes and secured the rotary plates. I then clamped the stock in my manual rotary setup and first installed a surfacing bit to make each side perfectly level in each of the 4 positions. The surfacing is done, so now I'm first going to do all 4 roughing passes. I used an extra long end mill from Amana Tool to reach a carving depth of almost 80 mm. And now you can see why I installed all the cardboard and paper to protect the gantry from all the static epoxy flakes clogging up the belts. Each of the 4 sides took just over 7 hours of carving, so after almost 30 hours of roughing, I can clean this up and start the finishing passes. I swapped the end mill for an extra long bullnose bit for the finishing passes. 16 hours later, all the finishing carves are completed, so now I need to manually sand down the carving edges and the areas that the router bit could not reach. I removed the rotary plates. I used a belt sander to remove the axle and roughly shape the neck. After that, I used a Dremel with the sanding drum and flap wheel for the more detailed work, to finish the polishing by hand with sanding paper. I'm going to make the pedestal out of the leftover epoxy and some white oak that I had lying around. I designed the pedestal in VCarve so that the pocket would be big enough to fit the epoxy disc. I cut 3 pieces of oak to size and then jointed the bottom and edges for a seamless gluing contact. While the glue was drying, I tapped the epoxy out of the bucket and sanded the proud rim flush. The next day I planed the oak board for a flat surface, secured it onto the CNC bed and installed an upcut end mill for the dowel holes and hollowing out the bottom. After the bottom side was done, I flipped it around for the roughing of the top side. Then installed a ball nose bit for the finishing pass. And then a V-bit for engraving the name of the statue. I then laid a bead of glue in a groove, pressed in the epoxy disc and let it dry overnight. The following day I used a surfacing bit to reduce the height that the epoxy was sticking out above the wood. And cut out the pedestal with an end mill. I smeared just enough Fuse-It from liquid nails on the bottom of the statue so that this sticky stuff would not squeeze out when pressing it onto the pedestal. Finally, I coated everything with 2 layers of clear wood finish. So that's it. Thank you for watching.